name is Juan Carlos Rosas, and I'm the architectural and design representative to Benjamin Moore. In trying to understand the palette of what was going on here in Miami Beach, I had to take it a step back and try to understand the history of what was going on at the time. It's a period that begins in Paris with the Arts Décoratifs, and it eventually makes it down to Miami Beach, and it takes about 10 years to make it down. In that interim, in the process of going from Paris to New York, you see the Chrysler Building, you see the Empire State Building, it moves to Chicago. By the time it makes it to Miami, we have the crash of 1929, and we have the Depression period. So things really change. It changed for us. Buildings get purged from detail. However, the architects that we had in Miami Beach were doing something very good. They were doing architecture that was vernacular. They were responding with their architecture to the climate. You can see that in details, in architectural details, where you have the eyebrow, for example, on top of a window. When I started to search for the palette, I found this slide that you see. And I wanted to not understand what was it about the palette, but why the palette? What did the architects and designers have to work with so they could create what they were creating? So in understanding the product that they were using, I came upon this slide which has a calcimite. And calcimite is a type of paint that was used at the time because the construction being done here in Miami Beach was mortar, and calcimite tends to fortify mortar. So it was a different condition of what was going on in New York, as well as in Paris, and as well as in Chicago. So the architects build these, I would call them like jewelry boxes of building and architecture. And not only do they do vernacular and proper architecture for the time, but also the colors that they were using were congruent with the time. What that means is that the pigments that they were using, the inks and dyes that they were putting into the calcimite, right? Calcimite, let's take that back for a second. It's made with salt, lime, and chalk. So these are very white powders. And these powders were mixed with milk, flour, egg whites, and salt, which sounds like something I could eat, right? Yeah. Right, but you couldn't, because it also had glue, it also had it had soaps, and it had soil, and most importantly, it had Portland cement. So this paint was a very thick product that actually coated the building. When you're departing with a product that has gray in it, like Portland cement, right, you're not getting a purity of a color. So when you're adding dyes to this calcium product, the product tends to not really grab a lot of color, therefore the colors are pretty light. They remain light, and they remain slightly muted because of the gray of the Portland cement. So then things change, of course. Then in the 1950s, when paint products change and new technology it's coming about in the paint business, it's able to grab more pigment. So there's a movement in the US to paint buildings green and mustard and brown and like a sunset yellow, and that started to happen in the 50s in Miami Beach. And it kind of starts to lose the personality of the building, but it was what was fashionable at the time. So architects and designers proceed to be using that. Then a decade later, in the 1960s, we get an influx from elderly, and Miami Beach was known for that. The situation with that is that they were on a fixed income, and some of them were impoverished. So there was not a lot of color, there was not a lot of renovation going on in buildings, right? Then comes the 70s, and we have a visionary. We have Barbara envision Miami Beach and understand the importance of these buildings. And in 1976, Ms. Katteman forms the Miami Design Preservation League. And that is the league that helps preserve these buildings. And in doing so, she teams up with Leonard Horowitz, who comes up with a palette understanding the original palette that the architects intended at the time. So he goes back to understanding that history and understanding what was going on at the time to create a new palette. And in 1982, when he paints one of the buildings, it's just 3 blocks away from here on Washington and 7th. That building gets published in progressive architecture, and it changed Miami Beach forever. It gave a stamp, it gave an identity to Miami Beach. The colors being used were very impactful. You know, he came up with a pastel palette based on the previous palette that was created, but now departing from a base of a paint that has more white in it, that can accept some color. So he put all these colors together. He's quoted for saying that he was the icing on the cake. He was putting the icing on the cake on these buildings. And that helped create an identity to Miami as well as to Miami Beach. So here I have some very quick images of some buildings when, back in the 80s actually, there was something where buildings were turned to white. They were kind of washed off all over again. And it kind of loses the identity. Miami Beach is known for its color. Horowitz dedicated to make sure that would happen, and we are respected because of that. So you can see how color, as you said earlier, Cheryl, brings an emotion. So these are some other buildings on Ocean Drive, and they do tell a story when they have color added to them. And then one of the things that we can do today is not only give them color, but we can also, because of technology, give them a higher contrast and a higher saturation in exterior color. We do get a lot of phone calls from architects that want to match a Pantone color. Benjamin Moore makes paint for architecture and interiors and how it changes with the light. Pantone is making a color for product. So they're in 2 different platforms, right? But we do get a lot of those calls of architects uniting the interior and the architecture with their marketing. One of the things that we see that is going on is using more saturation in buildings. So we do see more of designs where a color ends, the next one begins. It's a non-stop situation. It's constantly happening. So in using contrasting colors, it evokes an emotion, right? Color evokes an emotion. There's something a color tells us, a way that it makes us feel. It's like a stamp in our brain. It's a memory that we have, an experience that we have with a color. So in combining these, it's like combining different experiences that we have. So we do also encourage architects and designers to start experimenting and putting these colors together, which is a very good example to be here in Miami Beach and see what was done in the 80s when Miami Beach started to flourish. So yeah, we do encourage the architects and designers to do that.